we know that we can pass data to a component like a number, or we can also pass a function to a component as a parameter, just like we see here. But besides those, we can also pass content to a parameter. When we talk about content, we mean UI, like HTML, React components, and so on. So let's see an example of that. Actually, two examples. The first one is going to be the easy one, and the second one will be a little bit tricky. So let's start with the simple one. So let's go here to our conditionals if several components, and I want to put here below this display results another div, and let me even comment this out because this is from another example and we don't care about that anymore. I want to make an example in which I will have a component here and I will be able to pass content as a parameter. So let me create that component. Let me right click on src, new file. I'll call it project content.tsx, enter. Let me minimize this. Export default function project content, because we want to project content into this component. Props, and I will say project content props, which is going to be the interface that represents the shape of the parameters of this component. Let me write the interface here. So now we want to accept content as a parameter. The default way of doing that is to say children. This is the default name for a parameter that deals with content. And what is going to be the data type of this parameter? React.reactNode. In this way, I can pass here through these children whatever I want. It can be text, it can be a button, it can be a component. Let's see that. Let me come here and I will just say here h2 top part and then h2 bottom part. I want to show you that I can project the content here in the middle, and let me say props here. I always forget that. Props children. I want to show you that I can project content in the middle of the component. So let's see that. Let me come here to my conditionals if several components, and let me say project content, and let me import this. Import project content from project content, and now let's come down here, and here I can put again whatever I want. Let me put a simple button. Let me pass a button as a parameter. This is a button as a parameter. Let me Ctrl K S to save everything, and let's come back here, and as you can see here we have top part, bottom part, and this is a bottom as a parameter, which means that indeed we are passing content as a parameter. I can pass something like a component, like the simple component which we have seen in the past. Let me save, and let's see here that we have top part, hello world, this is a subtext, and bottom part because this is the content of the simple component. And we're not limited to pass only one thing. I can say fragment here. You see how important fragments are. Now I can pass this and also our button, my button. Let me save and let me go back here. And as you can see, we have the simple component, the button, and bottom part, which means that indeed we are passing parameters to a component. We are passing content to a component. We can pass as much content as I want. And not only that, I can pass functionality with this content. For example, I can say here on click, and I can say here console log, I was clicked. For example, save. Let's come back here. Let me press F12 and let me go to the button and click on it. And you can see I was clicked. So we can pass UI, we can pass behavior, and so on. So this is really great when you want to have reusable components and some parts of that component is going to be passed as a parameter, even if it is UI, even if it is behavior of that UI. Now, what happens if we want to project several things? And I don't mean like this using a fragment. What if I want to project content into different parts of this component? For example, below the bottom part, let's say that I want to project other content. We can do that. For that, we have to do the following. Right now, we are using children as the name of the parameter that receives the content. And that is what allows me to simply being able to pass the content like this. But if I am going to have different parameters that are going to receive content, I can not only use children, but I have to use other names like, I don't know, bottom part, React node. And now I have to come here and say props bottom part. Now, this is normal, but what is different is this part. Now, in order to pass that parameter, I have to pass it through here, like bottom part, expression, and I can say, for example, this, and here I can put whatever I want. Let me say that I want to put an spam. This is the end. Let me save everything, and let's come back here. Let me close this. And as you can see, we have this is the end here. So we have top part, we have the simple component, we have the bottom, we have bottom part, and we have the content that I am projecting just below the bottom part message that I have here. So as you can see, in order to use different parameters for projecting content, you must pass them through an attribute like this. Children is special. Children, you can pass it like this inside of the tags of the component, but for other parameters you must use this style as we're doing here. Now, I told you that I wanted to do two examples. This was the first one and this was the simple ones. I want to do something a little bit more advanced. What if I want to project the content that we are going to display in this option? We are in our select number component. What if I want to project the content that is going to display the option in the select, in this select that we have here? Now, we know that we have to use a parameter here, like select content, but think about it. I need to be able to access this index plus 1 from the parent in order to indicate where I want it to appear. For that, I have to use something different. Instead of passing, just like we were doing here, instead of passing a property of type React node, we need to use a function that is going to receive a number, and I say a number because index plus 1 is a number, and it's going to return then React.ReactNode. Now, that's something that we can do. We can copy this and we can delete this from here and use an expression and say select content and pass the index plus 1 expression. And of course, we have to say props. And let me put this in another line so that you can see everything. But as you can see now, the content that we're going to display in the select, it's going to come from the parent. Let's see that. Let's see that I can come here into the select number component, and in here I can say select content, and I can use a function. Here is the value, and I can say a backtick here, select, and let's say here value, like select 1, select 2, select 3, or whatever. This is just an example. So as you can see, I am using the value that we are getting from index plus 1 in order to construct what I want to display in the select. So let me save and let's come back here. And as you can see, we have rate this website, select 1, select 2, select 3. And I can select, for example, 3. And let me press F12. And as you can see, we have 3 here, which means that indeed, we are able not only to pass content as a parameter, but also to use information from the child component into the parent component in the part in which I am declaring what I want to project. This is something that we're going to use later in the course for the application that we're going to build. In this video, we are going to explore some of the different ways in which we can work with CSS in React. So for that, we are going to create a new component. Let's right click on src, new file, and we're going to say css examples.tsx, and let's create our component. We already should know how to do this by now. Examples, return, fragment, and that should be it. Now let me put this on the index tsx file. Let me put this here and here and here, and we're good to go. Let's go back here and let's put an h1 css examples. So the first way of using CSS in React is the normal way which we have been using in web development throughout the years, and that is by using a simple CSS file. So let's go here to the Explorer, and in here you can find this index CSS file. And let's say, just for example, that I want to create a class called red, which will have this property color red. And now I can come back to CSS examples, and I can say here, and let me minimize this, I can say here, you know we can't do class because this is JSX, and in JavaScript, class is a reserved keyword, therefore we have to use class name. Now here I will say red, and let me say Ctrl+KS to save everything, and let's go to Google Chrome, and let me refresh. And here, as you can see, we have CSS examples in red. So we are using CSS. Now, what happens if you don't want to use a global CSS rule like this red class that we have here? And I say a global CSS rule because this index CSS that we have here is imported from this index TSX, which means that it applies to the whole application. There are several ways in which we can create CSS rules that will only apply to this CSS examples component. One of them is to use styles. For example, let me create here an h2, and I will call it subtext, and then I want to say, instead of a class name, I can use a style. With a style, I can create CSS styling is specific for an HTML tag. For example, as you can see here, I am passing an object into the JSX expression. So here I can put my CSS rules. For example, color blue. I'll say that subtext is going to be blue, so I say color blue. Now let me save, and let's come back to Google Chrome, and as you can see, we have blue here. And we are not limited to only using one rule. I can say comma and put another rule like font size 5 pixels, save. Let's come back here, and as you can see, the subtext is really small. I can barely look at it. But the important thing is that, and let me put a more normal size like 25. Now you can see it again. The important thing is that now we have this style here at the level of the HTML element. And of course, this styling will only apply to this h2 that we have here. Now, something else that we could do, because this is a JavaScript object, you can have that as a variable here at the level of the component. For example, let me say here const square, and I will create an object that will display a square on the screen. So let me say here background color, which is going to be green. Then I will say height, let's say 50 pixels, width 50 pixels also, and let me do some margin left just because we can, 1 rem. Now let me come here and I will say div, and in this div I will say style square. Now let me save, and let's come back here, and as you can see we have this square here, this green square that comes from these properties that we have here. And of course, since this is a constant which we can reference through how our component, I can use it several times if I want. Let me put a break here, save, And as you can see, we now have 2 green squares here. Now, another way in which we can have local CSS styling here in this component is by using CSS modules. The idea of a CSS module is like this index.css. It is going to be a CSS file, but it will only apply when we import it and use it. This is different, by the way, as saying here, let me say for example, and this is just an example, let me say here something like CSS examples CSS. Let me say that I have a CSS file, right? And I import it like this. You are not just importing this, you are not only importing this for this component. I wanted to make this note because if you import a CSS file like this, then whatever CSS rule that it has, it will apply to the whole application. It will not only apply for this component. No, it will apply for everything. What I am saying is that if you have a CSS module, this is not a CSS module. If you have a CSS module, then you can apply it only to this component that we have here. So let's do that. Let me comment this out because this was just an example. We don't even have this file, but I wanted to clear that out for you because that is a common mistake from React beginners. So how do we create a CSS module? In order to create a CSS module, we have to come here to the Explorer, and in here we're going to create a new file. So right click, new file. I will name it CSS examples.module.css. Enter, and in here we can put whatever CSS rules we want. For example, I can say, let's say primary color, and I will say just color orange, semicolon here. Now save, and now this class that I have here will only be applied to a React component that imports it and uses it. For example, let me go back to CSS example, and let me say here, import CSS from, and I will say CSS examples.module.css, semicolon here. Now, through this CSS variable, I can use this CSS class that we have here. For example, let me create another break here and then an h2, but I want to say here class name, and here I will put an expression and I will say CSS, and we need to use this syntax and say here primary color. Remember that from the preview of JavaScript, we learned that we can access JavaScript objects or the properties of JavaScript objects using square brackets, and this is important in this case because we have a dash here. And here we are going to say this is a text style from a module. So I can save, and now look at this. Here, as you can see, this is orange. And not only that, if I come here and let me create yet another text, and let me say this is an example not from module. Okay, so I will say class name, but I want to say here primary color. Okay, so let me save, and let's see if this primary color is going to pick up this CSS styling from here. And the answer is no. It doesn't matter. Let me come back here. It doesn't matter that I am using the same name for the class primary color because I am not using this CSS object that comes from the module. I cannot access this styling that I have here. So I can safely use primary color as a class name in my React application, and it doesn't matter because I can only use this styling from here by using this CSS object that I get from the module. So as you can see here, we have this orange and we have this black. So as you can see, we can have global CSS styling through CSS files like index.css. We can have a styling in the same component by using the style property, and we also can have CSS styling at the local level by using CSS modules. And by the way, before I forget, let me right click here, inspect, just so that you can see how this works. If you see here, we have CSS examples primary color and this random string at the end. This means that this is the real name of the class that we created here. As you can see, what it happened is that we're getting a random string attached to it so that it is unique throughout the application. Another React hook that we can use is useEffect, which is used to work side effects on your components. A side effect is anything that is not related to the component's output value. We remember that the component's output value is UI. One example of this will be changing the title of the HTML document. This is not related to the output of the component, that is, the UI that the component produces. When we want to modify something outside of our component, useEffect is the appropriate option for this. Another example would be making HTTP requests or using functions like setTimeout and setInterval. Speaking of setTimeout and setInterval, the useEffect allows us to clean up the resources used. With useEffect, we can execute a method when loading the component and just before it is going to be destroyed. Also, the useEffect hook that we have will be executed with each rendering of the component. That is, they are executed when the component is loaded, each time the component is rendered, and when the component is destroyed or removed, the cleaning functionality of the useEffect is executed. Something interesting that useEffect offers us is that we can indicate conditions to prevent it from being executed. For example, we can indicate that unless a certain value changes, then the hook should not be executed again. This is quite useful to keep our application with a high level of performance because this way we avoid running a function repeatedly unnecessarily. Let's see how to use useEffect. So let's see a few examples of useEffect. First, we are here in the app component. What I want to do here is that I want to cut everything from here and put it on its own component because we are going to be using the app component. So let me right click here, new file, clock example.tsx, and I will say export default function clock example, and let me paste that here, and let me import everything. That should be it. Let me close. And now what I want to do is that I want to create a new component which will have useEffect examples.tsx, and let me say export default function useEffect examples, parenthesis here, return here, and a fragment here with an h1 useEffect examples. Okay, so we are going to use these useEffect examples here in the app component, and let me put this like this and this like this, and now let me import that. Import useEffect examples from useEffect examples, and now let's come to index. Let me delete this from here and let me put app in here. So now if we save everything, we should have this. Let me refresh here, useEffect examples. Okay, so our first example is going to be that we're going to see that the useEffect function is going to run immediately after we load up the component. So let me say useEffect control dot to import use effect, and we need to pass here a function as a parameter, as you can see. Now this will get executed immediately. So let me say, for example, console log component loaded, and let me say save, and let's come back here. I will refresh F12, and as you can see, we have component loaded. Awesome. Now, I told you that besides that having the use effect running when loading the component, we can also run a function just before the component is destroyed, and this is useful for cleaning up resources. So the way we do that is by returning something from here, which is going to be a function, and this function in here is going to run before the component is destroyed. So let me say here console log the component will be destroyed. So how do we test this? Well, let's go to the app component and let me use a checkbox. I will say here input type checkbox. I will say here height, and let me come here. I need use state. I need use state because I want that when we click on this checkbox, we remove this use effect from the UI. So we need to use an state variable. So const height set height equal to use state, and by default this will be false. And then we are going to use here a ternary operator. We're going to say height ternary operator. We're going to put here null. Otherwise, we're going to display the component. And of course, we're going to put here an onChange equal to expression. And here I will say set height, and we're going to pass the negation of height. And we're good to go. Let me save. Let's come back to Google Chrome. I will refresh. We have height all the way up here, but that is fine. If I click on height, then the component was hidden. And not only that, but we have in the console, the component will be destroyed. And if I clean the console, let me clear the console. I'll click on height, so we will show the component, so we have component loaded. And if I click on height one more time, we are going to see that we have the component will be destroyed. So great. This is definitely working. So what else can we do? Well, one example that we mentioned is that we can use a side effect in order to change the title of the HTML document. Let's do that. Let's come here. Let's go to the use effect samples, and I will create another use effect. I can have as many use effects as I want. I will say here this. And what do I want to do? I want to have a button, and I want to put in the document's title the amount of times the user has clicked on the button. So let's do that. Let me say here div, and I will say here button you have clicked X times. The X is going to be the number, and the X of course have to be a state variable because we want to change the UI every time the user clicks on the button. So let me say here const clicks set clicks equal to use state 0 as a default value, control dot to bring use state, and now here I will use clicks, and in button I will use a onClick, should be written like this, and here I will say set clicks, and I will pass clicks plus 1. So let me put this in another line so that you can visualize everything better. And now what I want to do is that I want to come here and say document.title equal to, let's use clicks times. So let me save and let's come here and let me refresh. And here as you can see you have clicked 0 times. I can close this, I can click on here, and as you can see the title have been updated, and I can keep clicking, and as you can see we have that the title is getting updated. This is great, but there is a problem. If I press F12, you are going to see that we have the component will be destroyed and the component loaded message repeated several times. But why is that? Well, we are re-rendering the component, right? Which means that even though it is only re-rendering a part of the component. The component is still going through the stage of being destroyed, so it gives you the chance of cleaning up resources. So that isn't great. What can we do about it? Well, something else that we can do is to use indicators that allows us to specify when we should run these useEffect functions, because maybe this function is simple, maybe this function is efficient, but what if you have a complex calculation here? You may not want to run that every single time you click on this button. So what can we do? Well, what we can do is to put a list of dependencies here. For example, here we can put an empty array, which means that this will only run once. We can also do the same by indicating that a dependency of this useEffect is this clicks state variable that we have here. So if I paste this here and I save, I can come back to Google Chrome and I will refresh. And now if I click on here, you can see that now here in the console, nothing else is getting written. We're not getting the component loaded message repeated several times. And if I click on hide, you can see that anyway, the component will be destroyed, will be shown in the console, indicating that we still have the opportunity to clean up the resources. So as you can see, we can use useEffect for several things, like running a piece of functionality when the component is loaded, running a piece of functionality just before the component is destroyed, and also if we want to use a side effect and we want to have a dependency so that that useEffect function only runs under certain circumstances, like when updating this clicks variable that we have here. We are going to be using useEffect a lot throughout this course when building our own application. We have seen in the past that we can use properties to pass values to components. For example, here we have the select number component and we are passing values like select content and unselected. That is okay because from the parent component I wanted to send that information. But what would happen if we wanted to pass a value not to select number but to a child of select number, so a child component of select number? Well, we would have to pass that value through the select number component and then pass that through that child component that we wanted to use. Now, that is okay for situations in which there are like 2 or maybe 3 levels of components, but when you have like a deep tree of components, like 7 levels deep, then this becomes really tough because then you would have to pass from a component to the child component and that component to the child component and that component to the child component and so on until you arrive to your destination. There is a better way of doing that, and that is by using the useContext React hook. With the useContext React hook, we establish a communication channel between components, between any components. They don't have to be close together. They don't have to be parent and child. They can be as far away from each other as possible, and it doesn't matter because with the useContext React hook, we can establish a communication channel between those components. And not only that, not only between two components, but actually with the useContext hook, we can establish a broadcast channel in which we can send a message to multiple components at the same time. Let's see that. First, let me create a small component structure. I will create a component, new file. I'll call it grandparent tsx. And let me say export default function grandparent. I will return from here actually just a component, which we are going to create right now. Right click here, new file, parent tsx, enter, export default function parent, return, and finally we're going to create yet another component which is going to be called child.tsx. and here I will say export default function child return, and here we will have a fragment. Now the child component is going to be a child of the parent component. So here I will import child, let me say child here, and let me import this component here, let me say import child from child, and then parent component is going to be child of grandparent. So let me go to grandparent, let me say here parent, and in here I will say import parent from parent. Now we have our structure, and of course let me close this and this because those were just examples. I want to come here, and here I want to put my grandparent component, and let me import that. Let me copy this, import grandparent component from grandparent. Now let's say that I have the following situation. Let me minimize this. We have this input checkbox here, right? So what I want to do is that in the child component, I want to do something when this onChange event executes. Now, how can I do that? Well, I could put something like a variable here and then pass that value to the grandparent and then pass that to the parent, which then will pass that value to the child component, and then something will happen. Now, I don't like that because you have to pass a value through components that don't really will use that value. Grandparent doesn't use that value, parent doesn't use that value. The only one that will use that value is the child component. So what we can do is to establish a communication channel between child and app through the useContext React hook. So let's do that. So the first thing that we need to do is to create a context. With the context, we will be able to send messages from our app component to the child component. So let me come here and let me create a new file. I will call it value context.ts, not tsx, ts. And let me say here import React from React, and let's say const value context equal to React create context, and in here I can pass a default value that will be used in certain scenarios. In my case, I want the default value to be false. Okay, now let me export default value context because I want to be able to use this value context from my application. So now let me go to the app component because I want to use that value context. Let's import it first. Let's say value context from value context, and now here I have to put the value context dot provider, and in here I can say grandparent. So we are wrapping the grandparent inside of the value context provider, which means that every children of this value context provider will be able to access the value that I send through this value context. Now I need to pass a value here, which in my case is going to be height, which is our state variable, because we're changing that value when we click on the checkbox. Now, how do we pick up the change in value of this height state variable from the child component? Well, for that we have to go to the child component, and now we have to use the useContext component. Let me say here const value equal to useContext control dot to import useContext, and here I will put value context control dot to import value context, and now from here I can say something like h3. Let me say here child component, and then in the next line h4 the value is, and I will say here just value. And now as you can see, we are getting access to the value that we are sending through this value attribute from the app component all the way through the child component. Let's see that. Let's see that I can save everything, and I will come back to Google Chrome, and I will refresh the page. And as you can see, we have nothing here. That is because I need to go back here and say to a string so that we can see false. Okay. Now I will refresh one more time just in case. And now let me click on hide and we have true here. And I can click again and we have false. And not only that, I told you that we could use this value context as a broadcast of a message. For example, what if I not only want to get this value from the child component but also from the parent component? I can do the same. I can copy this and paste it here, and I can control dot here to bring use context, and I can also control dot here to bring value context, and now I can use that value. I can say, for example, I can say a fragment here and wrap our child into the fragment, and in here I can use the value in whatever way I want. For example, I can say expression value ternary operator, the value is true or the value is false, just as an example. And let me put this in a div. Let me put this in a div. Okay, that is better. Now let me save and let's see what we have. Now we have the value is false and the value is false. This is from the parent. Let me write here from the parent, save. Now we have from the parent the value is false and this is from the child. And if I click on here, you can see that we have from the parent the value is true and the value is true. And if I click on here one more time, we have from the parent the value is false and the value is false on the child component, which means that we are changing the value of this hide variable which we are passing through the context provider, and then that is broadcasting that change to any component that wants to pick up that change. In our case, that is the parent component and the child component, and it doesn't matter how below in the tree structure those components are, they can pick up this change. And not only that, something that we will do in the future is that we will be able to send a message, for example, from the child component back to the app component. We will use this for some sort of alert system in which we will be able to alert about something all the way to the top of our component hierarchy. We do that by passing a function through this provider, and then the child component will be able to use that function to invoke a function from the app component. Again, we will see that when we build the application for this course. In this video, we are going to talk about error boundaries. The idea of error boundaries is that you can gracefully catch some errors that occur on your React applications and not have the whole thing blow up, but instead show a custom UI for that component that had the exception. Let's see that. First, let me create a new component, a really simple component that will display some information. Let me say display grade.tsx. This display grade component is going to be about receiving the grade of a student and showing a message depending on the grade. So let me say here function display grade props display grade props, and let me create that interface, and I will say here grade, which is going to be a number, and then here I will say return fragment, and then I will say display, and I will say props grade. So here I will define that function display, and I will say grade number, and this will do the following. If grade is greater than 90, we're going to say return parentheses div h3 excellent job. Otherwise, else if grade less than or equal to 90 and grade greater than 80, then we're going to say return div h3 well done. Otherwise, we will say else if grade greater than or equal to 0 and grade less than or equal to 80, we're going to say return diff h3 better luck next time. Finally, if the grade is less than 0, we're going to say throw this is impossible. Okay, semicolon here. Okay, so we have this logic in which we are displaying some custom UI depending on the grade of the student. So okay, now what we're going to do is that we're going to use this component here on the app component. So let me comment all of this, which was from a previous example, and I will have an array of grades, and we are going to have a few of them like 35, 95, minus 5, and then 55. Okay, so a lot of 5, but that's okay. What I want to do is to say here grades.map, and I want to say grade and use the display grade component. Let me import it. I want to import this display grade from display grade, and let me say here grade equal to grade and key equal to, and for the key we can use the index, so let's say here index, and let's pass index here. So okay, let's see what we got. Let me save everything, Ctrl K S, and let's go to Google Chrome, and let's see that here we have error, this is impossible. It's like, okay, this is a little bit over the top, and if we click on the X, we don't get anything. So alright, but maybe I don't want that. Like, there is only one grade that has an error, but I don't want to not be able to display everything else. For that, we can use the error boundary. The error boundary will allow me to contain the error in the instance of the display grade component that contains the error, and everything else will work the same. Okay, so let's do that. For that, we have to create a new component. Right click here, new file. We can call it error boundary.tsx. Now, this is an instance in which we are obligated to use a class component because the functionality that requires a error boundary to function is not available for functional components. So let's say class error boundary, let me say boundary extends react.component, and let me say here we can say error UI, which is the parameter, and the parameter can be of type react node, as we have seen in the past, comma, the state. We have to define the shape of the state, and it's going to be has error, boolean, and message a string. And we can close this here, and let me put this in another line so that you can visualize it better. And let me say here curly brackets. Let me put that here. And as you can see, what we have is that we are defining a component which will have a parameter called error UI, and the state will have a has error, boolean, and a message string. You can think of this state as if we were creating two use states, one with has error and one with message. So two use states mean two state variables that we can use. If you don't like to create ad hoc definitions like this, you can always use your interfaces. Let me write this like an interface just that you can see that you can do that. Let me say error boundary props, just in case you find that more comfortable. Error UI, react node. So let me say here, instead of this, error boundary props, and then interface error boundary state. And then I can copy this or cut it and paste it here, eliminate the comma, semicolon, and semicolon here, and I can use this in here. And let me put this in the same line, and that is basically the same. You can do it this way if you prefer to. So let's come here and let's get to work. First, we need a constructor. So props error boundary props super props this state equal to has error false by default, and message or error message should be an empty string. Now we need to do the following. We need to say static get derived state from error. This will run when there is an error, and here I will say return, and I will change the state. I will say has error equal to true and message equal to error, which is this error that we're receiving here. Then we can also say component did catch, which is a lifecycle method of a component that will contain error information. And in here you can do whatever you want. You can, for example, just console log the error or something like that. And then the most important part is the render. Remember that in the render is where we put what we want the component to render. So here we're going to do the following logic. We're going to say if this state dot has error, if there is an error, then I want to check that the user actually passed a error UI. If he did, then we're going to return that error UI. Let me put here props error UI. Else, we're going to return a custom error UI, which we will make up here, state.message. Otherwise, else, we can say return these props children. So what are we doing here? We're saying that if there is an error, then we want to display the error UI if it is present. If it is not present, then we're just going to return an H3 with the error message. Else, if there is no error, then we're going to return whatever the user wanted to show in the first place. So let's see that. Let me come here and let's use our component. Let's see that all that we have to do is to put this in another line to have more space. Now I will say error boundary, and I will put this here like this. Now let me import that error boundary component. Import error boundary from error boundary, semicolon here. It seems it's not a module, so we are not exporting this. Okay, let me export default error boundary, and now this is being exported. And now let me also come here, control dot here to import React. Now this is working. Now let's come back here, and this is working also. Now let's come back here, and we're going to say error UI H3. There was an error displaying the grade. Also, as always, we need to move this key index into this error boundary component that we have here, because the map function is creating several instances of this component, so we need the key. Now let me save and let's go to Google Chrome, and I will refresh. And as you can see, although we have this here and we have this here, if I click on the X, you will see that we still have our UI. We have better luck next time, excellent job, there was an error displaying the grade, and better luck next time. That means that indeed the application still works even though we got an error. And don't worry, that error that we have here is only in development. As you can see here, this screen is visible only in development. It will not appear if the app crashes in production. So as you can see, this page that we have here is only for development. In production, if your users encounter an error like this, they will only see there was an error displaying this particular grade, but not any other errors in any other part of the application, which was the mission of the error boundary component that we just built, that your application will continue to work, and wherever occurs an error, that error will only be contained in there. Now, something else that we have to do before finishing this one is that, let's go back here, and if I remove this error UI from here, you are going to see that we get an error because error UI is a mandatory parameter. One way to make it optional is to add here a nullable key. So now we can save And we can go back here, by the way, and see that there are no errors. And we can go back here. And as you can see, we have this is impossible here. Why do we have this is impossible here? Because remember that the default UI, in the case there is no error UI being passed from the parent component, is that we want to display the error message. And the error message being thrown by the display rate component is this is impossible, which is why we are seeing this is impossible here. But in general, I prefer to put my custom UI here, so I will have this like this. Another option to work with ensuring the correct submission of properties of a component is to use prop types. Prop types offers us a runtime verification mechanism of the properties or parameters of a component. This is different from what TypeScript does, as TypeScript works at compile time, not at runtime. It is important to note that prop types only work in development environments, as they are used for testing. In production environments, prop types are automatically disabled. In this way, we can have faster applications in production. Is it convenient to use prop types and TypeScript at the same time? In some cases, yes. This is recommended for components that will receive data from external entities that we do not control as parameters, such as web APIs. So, if we receive some data from a web API and we want to send that data into a component, then maybe we could use prop types besides using TypeScript, since it is at runtime that we will actually have access to the web API data. Prop types can help us to debug unexpected situations when integrating third-party services. Also, prop types only work for components. Meanwhile, TypeScript works for any part of your application. So if you have a function in a file, you can use TypeScript with it, but you cannot use prop types in that case. Specifically, with prop types, we can check things like A, that a component receives all the required properties or parameters, and B, that these properties are of the appropriate data type. In order to use prop types, we must first install the package prop types. So we say npm install prop types. Next, we import prop types, import prop types from prop-types. Then we can, for example, indicate that the name property is required. For example, if we have a component called displayName, we can say displayName.proptypes equal to name proptypes.string.is required, and in this way we are indicating that that parameter is required. There are many other validations that you can use with prop types, although in this course we are not really going to be using prop types that much. We saw that React uses the virtual DOM in order to be able to update the UI in a very efficient manner. We don't have to pay attention to code that updates the UI, we only need to update the state of our components and then React will take care of updating the UI. We learned that we have functional and class components and that we can do mostly the same with both, because with the introduction of React hooks, new features were added to functional components that class components already had. We saw that JSX is a syntax that allows us to write user interface using JavaScript. It is similar to HTML, but it is not HTML. JSX is then compiled into JavaScript functions using Babel, which are finally executed in the browser to produce the UI of our web application. States allows us to update the rendering of our component by changing variables. For that, we can use the React hook useState. React hooks are a set of functionalities that were added to the functional components to make them more useful for our developments. Props are properties or parameters that we pass to shell components to make them reusable. We can pass to shell components data, functions, and even UI content like HTML or other components. The React hook called useEffect allows us to work with side effects. A side effect is an action that does not directly intervene with the return value of our component. Some examples are making an HTTP request, editing the title of the HTML document, using setTimeout and setInterval, among others. The React hook called useContext allows us to have something like a global communication channel in our React application that will allow our components to talk to each other, doesn't matter where they are in the component hierarchy. With error boundaries, we can avoid the collapse of our web application by catching the errors that have occurred in our components and showing a custom UI in that case.